You're listening to The Jewish Truth Bomb with Lenny Goldberg.
Hey, this is Lenny Goldberg, and thank you for joining me today. Today's Tisha B'Av. We mourn the destruction of the temples. It's a day in our history where a lot of bad things happened. And most of us don't even know what we're missing by not having the temple, because we never saw it, we never experienced it. But the fact is, the Judaism we practice today, it's really just a relic or a replica of what Judaism is supposed to be, because Judaism is a temple-based religion. The exile turned it into a private thing, but when the temple stood, that was the center of Jewish life. The holiday of Passover. It wasn't about Leila Seder, sitting around at the Seder. That wasn't the highlight of Passover. It was bringing the Korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice. All the holidays, all the regalim, the pilgrimage holidays, it took on a totally different nature when we had the temple. The holiday of Sukkah, that meant Simchat Beit Shoavah. And you had this thing called the water drawing festival, Yisuach HaMayim. And during the nighttime celebration, they had these golden menorahs hoisted up on these poles. And it says they burned so brightly that they illuminated the entire city. And there was dancing and juggling and singing and orchestra of Levite musicians. We don't know what we're missing. Imagine all of Am Yisrael making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, leaving their homes. In a few months from now, tens and tens of thousands of Jews are going to go to Ukraine, to Uman, to where Rebbe Nachman Mibreslev is buried. And one of the reasons it's so inspirational for a lot of people is because when you have so many Jews together, praying together, that's very, very powerful. Imagine doing that at the temple in Jerusalem. That's the location where the Jews are supposed to gather. So when the temple stood, Judaism looked totally different than it does today. And that's why when the first temple was destroyed and was going up in flames, that groups of young priests, they gathered together with the temple keys in their hands. The Talmud says this. And they ascended to the roof of the sanctuary, and they said before God, Master of the universe, since we did not merit to be faithful treasurers, that is, we didn't safeguard the temple as we should have, and the temple is being destroyed, let the temple keys be handed to you. And so the Kohanim, the priests' final act of divine service was to throw the keys up to heaven. And the Gemara says a divine hand reached out of the clouds and caught the keys. And then the priests threw themselves into the flames that consumed the temple. Now, why would Jews throw themselves into the flames? Because they couldn't understand the Judaism without the temple. There's no temple, there's no Judaism. And so the Judaism we practice today is something else. We have the synagogue instead of the temple, and the synagogue is supposed to mirror the temple. That's where you say your prayers. Every synagogue has an Aron Kodesh, an ark, which houses the Torah scroll. That's a parallel to the Kodesh Kodeshim, held the original 10 Commandments. And in the synagogues, you have an ark, you have a parochet, your curtain, which covers the ark. Of course, that was also in the temple. And in synagogues, if they're Orthodox ones anyway, you have the men in one section, the women in another, seated separately. That's because in the temple, you had the Ezrat Nashim, the courtyard of the women, which was the area of the temple that was permitted to women. So everything we have and everything we do today is a remnant. It's a zecher to the temple, but it's not the real thing. We have to realize that. And in our prayers, in Shmona Esrei, we pray for the temple every day. And the question is, why don't we build it? Right? Why do we keep sitting on the floor on Tisha B'Av? I get it. If we're in the exile, you got no choice. You can't build the temple. You're not in Eretz Yisrael. And so you can't build it. And so we mourn for the temple. And even for those Jews who made it the land of Israel. Well, they were either under Turkish rule or British rule. So of course we had no choice. We couldn't build the temple. All we could do was sit on the floor and cry about it and read Echa, Lamentations. The question is, what's stopping us now? You know, sometimes we do things just out of habit. Like for 2,000 years, we've been crying on the floor, so we're going to continue crying on the floor. But sometimes you have to think about it. What prevents us now? We're in the land of Israel. We're under Jewish rule, not Turkish rule or British rule, which maybe makes it even harder, but that's another story. No, but the thing is, we don't even try to change our mindset. We just go back to doing the same thing that we've done the last 2,000 years, sitting on the floor and reading Lamentations as if there's no other option, as if there's no imperative to build the temple with our own hands. It's like we don't even think that the situation has changed. So a lot of religious Jews will tell you, well, the Mashiach has to build the temple. We have to wait for the Messiah. Or the third temple is going to come flying down from the heavens and land on the Temple Mount. And I don't want to get into that now to refute those theories because it's not so. Just like every other mitzvah in the Torah isn't dependent on the Messiah, neither is this one. And the whole thing about the temple coming down from the heavens, that's an Agadata. It's a midrash. It's not halacha. Since when do we learn halacha from Agadic sources? If the Messiah is going to build a temple, or it's going to descend from the heavens ready-made, why does the Rambam dedicate chapters upon chapters of how to build a temple? And he's talking about the third temple because the Rambam wrote his Mishnah Torah after the second temple period. So again, what prevents us from picking up the bricks and build a temple? So obviously this is a huge question. I'm not going to get into it on this podcast. But the fact is there is an awakening, more and more, that we should be doing more than just sitting on the floor. We should be taking steps to physically build the temple. There is an awakening about this. It used to be that nobody even went up to the Temple Mount. And there were all kinds of excuses why not. You would mention the Temple Mount to rabbis, they would hide under the table. Today, it's very, very accepted. Many big rabbis ascend the Temple Mount. It's something that's really catching on because as you learn the subject in depth, you learn that it is permitted. You just have to care enough to know how to prepare yourself properly to ascend the Temple Mount. And there are important institutions that have been established today to make people aware of what the temple is all about, to awaken in us, to make the building of the temple seem real and not some pipe dream. That's something that a long time ago, many years ago, when the temple stood, and then you have some story. No, it's not a fantasy. It's possible today. You have the Temple Institute. You have other places where they make the kalim, the vessels. So people see, it's doable. As a matter of fact, with the technology we have today, we can make the temple more easily and more beautiful than the first and second temple. But there's that obstacle we have in our heads because we're so used to being in the exile. So much so that even when the Temple Mount came into our hands in the 6-Day War, the famous cry, Harabayat Biyadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands, we went down to the Kotel. We didn't stay up on the Temple Mount because we didn't know about the Temple Mount. We were used to the Kotel. We had dreamed to come back to the Wailing Wall, but we left the Temple Mount, which is much holier than the Wailing Wall. If the Wailing Wall has holiness to it, it draws that holiness from the Temple Mount. But we descended from the Temple Mount, gave it to the Arabs because we're not prepared for it. We're not ready for it. We weren't educated on it. We were educated on the Kotel. But again, today there is an awareness and an awakening to ascend the Temple Mount and to build a temple. But there's the big obstacle. You know what the obstacle really is about building the temple? And why people don't think it's practical? Because you have mosques over there. Where are you going to build a temple anyway? On the second floor of the mosque? And so like everything else, and last week I spoke about the mitzvah to drive out the inhabitants of the land, and then you settle in it. The same thing here. First you have to remove the tumah, sur mirah. First you have to pop the pimple. You have to remove the mosque, and then you can build the temple because it'll be vacant, and then it'll be practical. Because the Arabs built their structure on the place of the temple, Dafka. They did it on purpose. On the holiest side of Judaism, that's where they placed their mosque. And so first of all, you have to erase that chilul Hashem, that desecration of God's name, that they put their mosque on our holy site. How can we achieve success? How can we win if on our holiest site you have a mosque there? How can Hashem give us the salvation that we're looking for when his home is defiled like that? And so on this Tisha B'Av, when you read the verses in Echa, Shualim El Chubo, the prophet laments that the foxes are up there. The foxes are in the Holy of Holies. That's where the pain is. Because as long as the foxes are up there, then the building of the temple will always just be a pipe dream, will remain a fantasy and not real. Moving on to the more mundane, and I'm talking mundane. One of the big news stories over the last few weeks is what was going on in the Sde Teiman detention center, where Hamas terrorists are held, the hardcore Nakba terrorists. We're talking the Hamas special forces who carried out the October 7th massacre. And what happened was there was a mini revolt by these Nakba terrorists as they were going to be moved to another facility. And in the course of the transfer, one of these terrorists, who's the murderer of at least 2 children, he assaulted an Israeli soldier, prison guard, and there was a fight in the prison. Now, there's background to this because there had been complaints by the prisoners that the Jewish guards are mistreating them, they're not getting enough air, they're not getting adequate food and exercise and so forth. And so there's this military justice division of the IDF, and they came to check things out and to arrest these Israeli prison guards who had been mistreating this Arab terrorist. And what happened was that as these military policemen were coming to arrest the soldiers barricaded themselves, preventing the military police from arresting the soldiers that they wanted to arrest. And that's what was all over the internet. You had these reserve soldiers, these prison guards, fighting this military police. In any case, the military police eventually barged in, arrested and disarmed the soldiers in front of the Arab prisoners without due process, based on allegations of these Nakba terrorists. Now, we're talking about the most dangerous prison there is out there, Sde Teiman. You have these far-left groups like B'Tselem, claiming that the prisoners are subject to systematic abuse. You have other leftist groups that have entered the prisons and noticed severe signs of violence and injuries on the bodies of these terrorists, etc. And so we have this ongoing court case in Beit Lid, in Netanya, where 5 soldiers are being prosecuted by the army prosecutor. And the prosecutors are basically taking the word of these Arab prisoners. And some of the accusations are very bizarre. Like this particular Arab terrorist said that something was shoved up his buttocks and he is wounded there. And none of that has really been proven. And there are cameras everywhere. And I get a little bit of inside information on all this because my son-in-law, he's the point man for Chonenu. If you don't know Chonenu, they are a very important organization that defends Jews in situations like this. Soldiers that are being incarcerated unfairly. Not just soldiers, but Israeli citizens that have been attacked by Arabs who retaliate. And when they retaliate in a measure that is considered disproportional, or a soldier retaliates, but he overstepped his bounds of the crazy IDF guidelines, this organization, Chonenu, they provide you with top-tier lawyers who could be making a lot more money working elsewhere. We're talking about the best legal minds who are ideological. They see the injustice of what's going on. And this organization, Chonenu, has been defending Jews for years. My kids, when they got in trouble, were defended by Chonenu. Back in the days of the disengagement from Gush Katif, my kids were arrested, and many times after that they were arrested. And the organization Chonenu, they're always there for you. And every Jew that gets in trouble in any way, if the case is nationally motivated somewhere, it's not a personal thing, but it's part of the ongoing struggle we have with the Arabs in this country. This organization, Chonenu, will defend you. And if you want to give tzedakah to a really good organization, you could check them out. Check out their website. You spell it the way it sounds, Chonenu, with an H at the beginning, Honenu. So I didn't really mean to plug Chonenu, but in any case, my son-in-law goes to these trials every single day, and he tells me what's going on. And it's unbelievable what you see. You see these army prosecutors from the Justice Department, which is a super leftist division. And just to see these prosecutors, just to watch them, my son-in-law says he just could vomit. They're so sterile. They're in their little bubble. They speak so high and mighty as they prosecute these poor soldiers who have the worst job of all, guarding these disgusting scum terrorists. And they sit there with their fat bellies and their phones. Most of them, by the way, are homosexuals. That's just a fact. Just saying that, okay? They have no idea what these soldiers have to face. And they put the screws to these soldiers on the basis of testimony from Nakba Arab terrorists. It is so disgusting. And most of these accusations, there's no real proof. As a matter of fact, my son-in-law told me last night that a doctor testified, a doctor of that jail, and he said that this particular Arab already had all kinds of wounds in that area of his body before this. Because what the Arab prisoners do is they stick all kinds of things up there, like cell phones, in order to hide it. In any case, they're blaming these Israeli prison guards. And by the way, we're talking about 5 prison guards. They're not single guys. These are reservists. They all have families. So it's not like you're taking some hilltop youth who's not married, who can sit in jail for a while. It won't be a big deal for him. We're talking about reserve soldiers, men with families. They can't sit in jail for months upon months for this garbage. And this whole episode reminds me of something that happened back in 1984. It was called the Bus 300 affair. It was called the Kav 300 affair. And what happened there was that 2 Shin Bet members, they executed 2 Arabs who hijacked the bus. What happened was that in April 1984, 4 armed Arabs from the Gaza Strip reached Ashdod, and they boarded as paying customers, as paying passengers, they boarded an Egged bus that was going from Tel Aviv to Ashkelon. It was Kav 300. It was the bus 300. That was the number. And it was en route from Tel Aviv to Ashkelon. It had about 40 passengers in it. And these Arabs from Gaza hijacked the bus shortly after it started to move. And they forced the driver to change direction and drive towards the Egyptian border. And while they were doing so, they killed a woman passenger. And what eventually happened was the army stormed the bus and they shot and killed the Arab terrorists. And according to the news that was published, all the hijackers were killed during the operation. But what happened was, one of these leftist newspapers, Hadashot, they published a front page photograph. This is on the front page of their newspaper. You see two of the hijackers alive and fully conscious. He's being taken off the bus by the security forces. And so he's alive. He wasn't killed. He was killed later on, though. So 4 of them were killed, but 2 of them were actually killed after they were taken off the bus during the interrogation or whatever. And so because of this photograph where you see 2 live Arabs coming off the bus, how did they get killed? Obviously, it wasn't during the shooting on the bus. And so there was an investigation for years, a public uproar demanding that the circumstances surrounding the deaths of these poor hijackers have to be investigated. So what happened after years, the Shin Bet leadership was all fired because it came out eventually that these 2 Arabs were not killed on the bus, but later on. The Attorney General at the time, Yitzhak Zamir, was forced to resign. The head of the Shin Bet, his name was Avram Shalom, he was forced to resign. In short, the country tore itself apart for 2 filthy, scum Arab murderers. And so that's exactly what's happening here with the Sde Teiman story. We're beating our breasts. We're bringing prison guards to trial for Nachba terrorists who murdered and raped Jews and tore their limbs off. And so what we're talking about here is a decadent and morally confused society that's incapable of distinguishing between good and evil. Because when you take the Torah out of the equation, there's no such thing as objective good or objective evil in the world. And so Israel wants to prove to the world how ethical we are. They want the world to marvel at our wonderful morality. And this past Shabbat, we started the book of Deuteronomy. And in chapter 7, verse 16, it says that you shall devour your enemies, have no mercy on them. That's the verse. Have no mercy on them. And the great commentator, the Ramban, writes, because through the mercy of fools, all justice is lost. And so that's it, the mercy of fools. And so this country is loaded with the mercy of fools. And that will enable the Arabs to repeat on even a grander scale the horrors of October 7th. Hamas Nachba terrorists who murdered Jews, Jewish men, women, and children, they don't have any rights. There's nothing immoral or illegal in destroying those who want to destroy us. Think about it. They massacre Jews, and then they surrender. Does that sound normal to you, to allow them to surrender when they choose to, no matter what they did? We surrender now. We have rights. Yeah, we hijacked the bus and declared we're going to kill all the passengers, and we killed a woman, but now we surrender. Yeah, we massacred Jews on Simchas Torah, but we're surrendering now. Yeah, we got a white flag. And by the way, Israel never imposed the death penalty. The most an Arab terrorist can get, even a Nachba terrorist, is a life sentence. And then what happens? Israel does some terrorist hostage exchange, and they get out. And by the way, going back to that 300 bus episode, Kav 300, in 1984, if the Shin Bet had not killed those 2 terrorists after they got off the bus, they would have been sent to prison, and they would have gone free the next year, because a year later, Israel released 1,150 hardcore terrorists. And so if that's the situation, why should Arab terrorists not try to kill Jews? And so, under the rules of the fools of mercy, there is nothing to deter the terrorists. He can murder Jews, surrender, get his rights, and then wait for a prisoner exchange. Moving on, I want to circle back to the subject of Tisha B'Av once again, and I want to talk about a real Jewish military leader. Somebody who didn't have the mercy of fools, to say the least, but he knew how to fight, he knew how to win. And he was a candidate to be the Messiah, and his name was Shimon Bar Kochva. You might have heard of him. And on Tisha B'Av, one of the few books you're allowed to learn is Midrash Echa, or Job, things that are sad. And in Midrash Echa, there's a whole bunch about Shimon Bar Kochva, the great Jewish general who led the rebellion against the Romans. And he is absolutely legendary, one of the greatest Jewish generals who almost succeeded in throwing out the Romans. After the Second Temple was already destroyed, we had the Bar Kochva rebellion that almost threw the Romans out of Israel. And by the way, about 60 years ago, the archaeologist Yigal Yadin, he found the letters of Bar Kochva. Letters of Bar Kochva. Unbelievable. Up until then, people thought it was some kind of myth. But there it was, preserved in those little caves by the Dead Sea. And you know, when you read those letters, he's as tough and gruesome as advertised. Anyway, in Midrash Echa, chapter 2, it speaks about Shimon Bar Kochva. It says like this. Rabbi Yochanan said that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, he would expound on the verse in Numbers, which says, Darach kochav meYaakov, which means a star will rise from Jacob. So that's a verse that was uttered by Bilam, and it's a verse about the Messiah, that a star is going to rise, a rising star from Yaakov, a shooting star from Jacob's children. And Rabbi Akiva says that this verse is going on Shimon Bar Kochva, because Kochva sounds like Kochav, which means star, and Rabbi Akiva said that this verse is going on Shimon Bar Kochva. And it says in the Talmud, Rabbi Akiva, when he would look at Shimon Bar Kochva, he would say, this is the Messiah. Now, before going on in the Talmud, why would Rabbi Akiva think that Shimon Bar Kochva is the Messiah? Because you have to remember, the Second Temple has been destroyed, and Shimon Bar Kochva is bringing it back. And if he succeeds, that's the Third Temple. Shimon Bar Kochva's rebellion was about 60 years after the Churban. And so if he could defeat the Romans and rebuild the temple, there you go, he's the Melech HaMashiach. Nobody expected an exile of 2,000 years. The first exile between the First and Second Temple was 70 years. Nobody's thinking that the next one's going to take 2,000 years. And so Rabbi Akiva already sees the success of Bar Kochva 60 years after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. And he declares that Bar Kochva is the Mashiach. And by the way, the Rambam says that Rabbi Akiva was the arms bearer of Bar Kochva. Okay, so now the Talmud continues to ask, why did Rabbi Akiva think that it was the Messiah? What did Bar Kochva do? It says like this. When the Romans would shoot a catapult stone, he would catch it on one of his knees, and he would propel it back at them. That is, it would rebound off his knees, and he would kill several of these Romans. And that's why Rabbi Akiva said what he said. And it says like this, Shimon Bar Kochva brought sovereignty back to Jerusalem for 2.5 years. And he had 200,000 men who bit off their fingers to show how tough they were. Okay, so he's got a tough army. And then it says, and the Emperor Hadrian took 80,000 Roman soldiers who laid siege to Beitar. The sages said to Bar Kochva, why are you causing the men of Israel to be blemished? That is, they're missing a finger. So Bar Kochva said, then how shall I test them? And they said to him, anybody who is not able to uproot a Lebanon cedar tree, then don't write him on your military roster. And so that's what Bar Kochva did. He had 2,000 of these, that is, with no thumb, and 200,000 of those guys who would uproot a tree. Okay, so now things are going to start going downhill for Bar Kochva. We'll see why. For 3.5 years, the Emperor Hadrian surrounded Beitar. Okay, so Bar Kochva is barricading himself in the fortress in Beitar. Remember, Masada, which everybody knows, Masada, that was an earlier revolt against the Romans. 60 years earlier, when they destroyed the temple, Masada was the last stand. But we're talking 60 years later, when Bar Kochva launched another rebellion, and he's in Beitar now. And it says like this, for 3.5 years, the Emperor Hadrian surrounded Beitar. And there was a great rabbi, Rabbi Elazar Modai, who was praying all the time and fasting so that Bar Kochva would succeed. And each and every day he would pray and say, Master of the universe, please don't sit in judgment today. That is, please don't have the Romans win this thing. And ultimately, Hadrian, the Roman emperor, he made up his mind to return to Rome. That is, he gave up already. But what happened? A certain Kutite, these are like the Shomerim, they're called Kutis, whatever. This Kutite went up to Hadrian and said, you know why they're succeeding? It's not just Bar Kokhba. They have this great rabbi, Rabbi Elazar Modei, and he's praying for them. That's why you can't beat them. Okay, so now this Kuti, he's going to cause a rift between Elazar Modei and Bar Kokhba. This is what he does. So this Kuti goes to Rabbi Elazar, who was standing and praying in the synagogue, and the Kuti made himself look as he was whispering into the ear of Rabbi Elazar Modei. He wasn't really whispering anything, but it looked like he was whispering. And everybody saw it, and they went to Bar Kokhba, and they said, hey, your uncle, Rabbi Elazar, you hear that? Rabbi Elazar was the uncle of Bar Kokhba. They said, your uncle, Rabbi Elazar, he's looking to make a deal with Hadrian and give up the city, because they saw the Kuti whispering in his ear, so they figured he's collaborating with the bad guys. And you have to understand that Bar Kokhba was suspicious, because during the first rebellion, where the Jews fell at Masada, the one you all know about, there were also rabbis then who were cooperating with the Romans. For instance, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he did not want to fight the Romans. And so it could be that Bar Kokhba looks at Rabbi Elazar as a traitor. So what does the Talmud say? So Bar Kokhba sent for the Kuti. And he asked the Kuti, what did you say to Rabbi Elazar Modei? And the Kuti answers Bar Kokhba, and he lies, but he lies very cunningly. He says, what did I say to him? If I tell you the truth, the emperor's going to kill me. And if I don't tell you, then you're going to kill me. And so when the Kuti said that, he made it seem that Rabbi Elazar Modei was on the side of the Romans, and he was sharing secrets with this Kuti. And so Bar Kokhba thought that Rabbi Elazar is betraying him. And the Talmud continues, when Rabbi Elazar concluded his prayers, he was told that Bar Kokhba wants to see you. And he went to Bar Kokhba. And Bar Kokhba asked him, what did that Kuti say to you? And he answered, I don't know what he said to me. I didn't hear anything. I was standing in prayer, and I have no idea what he was saying, if he was saying anything. And Bar Kokhba was filled with rage, and he gave him one kick with his foot, and he killed him. So Bar Kokhba kills his righteous uncle, and a bat kol emerged. A divine voice from heaven said, Oi, oi, to the shepherd who abandons the flock. Anyway, that was a big mistake by Bar Kokhba. And then Midrash Eicha brings something else that Bar Kokhba did wrong, that when he went out to fight, him and his soldiers would say, please Hashem, don't help us and do not hurt us. In other words, Hashem, don't do us any favors. You don't have to help us. Just don't hurt us. And so for that too, he was punished. And then the Midrash says that because of those sins, that caused Beitar to be captured, and Bar Kokhba was killed. And they brought his head to the Emperor Hadrian. And Hadrian said, who killed him? And a certain soldier said, I killed him. And Hadrian said, go and bring him to me. That is, I want to see his body. So the soldier goes to bring his body, and he found a serpent wrapped around his neck. And so he came back to Hadrian and said, I can't bring his body to you because there's a serpent around his neck. I can't go near it. And Hadrian said, it wasn't you who killed him. If his God didn't want him killed, nobody could have overcome him. That is, if his God hadn't wanted him killed, we never could have killed him. Anyway, that's the inspiring but also very sad, tragic story of Bar Kokhba and the fall of Beitar, which really was the final Churban. Ever since then, we've been in this exile, and we pray for the rebuilding of the temple to finish what Bar Kokhba started, because the blood of Bar Kokhba is in our veins, just like the blood of the Maccabees is flowing in our veins. That's it for me. Don't forget to check out my Bible classes, Lenny Goldberg's Bible classes. It's a podcast on Spotify and available on other platforms. And I'll be back next week, same time, same station.